Hello, I'm Jonah Wade,
And I'm Sam Dekbar.
and this is our CS2316 Final presentation. So here's our table of content, starting with the point of interest and purpose. So the point of interest and purpose of this experiment was over analyzing data of 60 countries to determine some correlations between some of the statistics, as well as just some overall conclusions about some of the statistics. And the reasoning that we did this was because if you're, we just find it interesting, and if you're, trying to figure out what might be a way to help solve some of the world's problems, you need to actually figure out, what you can actually do and not just kind of guess. So by determining areas that highly correlate with quality of life index, we hope to, get a little bit closer to figuring out, how to fix some problems and have a straightforward comparison between countries. So we expected, before we did anything with our data, that the purchasing power index would have the highest correlation with quality of life index, as just, purchasing power index tells you a pretty good idea of how much someone can do with their money, and so if you can do a lot with your money, we figured you're doing all right. So starting with our data collection process, we used 3 data sets. The first was our downloaded data set, which was over demographic indicators. And then our web requirement 1 was of quality of life index by country, and then also a world religion projections, and that was our JSON file. So we found our data sets in a few different ways. The first one with our demographic indicators, we found this from UN.org, which is the United Nations website. We then found our quality of life index by country. We found that from a website called Numbeo, which is a free internet database. And then our world religions projection we got from DataHub, which is an online data repository. And the data was originally sourced from the Pew Research Center. So beginning with our data cleaning process, our country list needed to be cleaned because not every country in the world was included in the data sets that we were looking at. So we only wanted to look at the data of countries that were included in all 3 data sets. So we then cleaned all the countries, or all the countries that were only included in 1 or 2 of them. We got rid of that. We also looked at some statistics that were, or more so, we looked at some countries that lacked certain statistics. And so if a country didn't have all the statistics in the data set, then we just cleaned that as well. And then some countries have multiple names. For example, the US is also called America. And so we needed to go through and make sure that all of the data sets, when they were referencing the United States, were actually referencing the same name. And that goes for a few other countries as well that are referred to as different names. So now our data analysis. We had 5 different insights, and the first was to answer the question, how does each country compare to others in each statistic? So we did this by we converted all of the statistics from the data sets into a percentile. So you can look at Argentina and notice that for net migrations, they are in the 48th percentile. And this was done by taking all the data and ranking, or taking all the countries and then ranking all the data in the data file. And then from that ranked data file, we were able to convert them into a percentile.
This is our code for Insight 2. Here we took every country from our data file and found what the most common religion was for each one. And then just kind of narrowed it down to a file that just contained that country and its most predominant religion, just so that we could see and access that kind of data. Code for Insight 3. This one, we took every country on that list from Insight 2 and grouped it by its most predominant religion. And from this, we mapped the average quality of life for each of those countries that were grouped, so that we could just have a singular file that contained each religion and the average quality of life of the countries that it's the most predominant in. This is our Insight 4 code. Here is a little different. We took all the percentiles that we made in Insight 1 and all of the important indexes that we're looking at from all of our data files, and then combined it all into one file called important percentiles, so that we could access the percentiles for every single index that we're interested in into one file. And then here for Insight 5, we took all those percentiles and we found the correlation coefficient between each index with each other so that it mapped out into a grid and told us exactly how almost they kind of affect each other if our assumptions are correct. So here's a list of our visuals. Our first visual was where we plotted our initial hypothesis indicator, which is health, which is yep. Sorry, that was wrong. Which is our quality of life. Okay, this is our visual. It maps the purchasing power index. That's what I meant to say, which was our hypothesis predictor with the quality of life percentile. And here you'll see that it has an R-squared value of 0.795, which is actually really high, and tells us that if our assumptions are correct, that we can assume that 79.5% of our variation in quality of life index can be explained in some way by variation in purchasing power index as far as our percentiles go. Here's our code for visual 2, and this one we just made a bar graph using those grouped religions that I was talking about earlier. It looks like this. So here on the left, you'll see that the average quality of life for each predominant religion group varies a lot, actually, with Judaism being correlated with the highest quality of life index, more than any other religion that we looked at, and unaffiliated countries where the unaffiliated group is of the most predominant, actually has the lowest correlation. Here's our visual 3 code, and this works with the correlation I was talking about earlier, and it just kind of color codes and shows how each index correlates with each other, which is really cool because we're not only just looking at quality of life index with all of these indexes on the left, we're also looking at every index and how it might correlate with every other index. And here we'll actually find that purchasing power index actually has the strongest correlation with quality of life index over any index with any other index, which is really cool. And that pollution index actually has the strongest inverse correlation over any index. And just from looking at this too, we can see that like sex ratio had a very low correlation as well as a lot of others like healthcare index. So onto our overall results and conclusions. Our prediction was correct that, indexes that have to do with how much money is in the region, such as purchasing power index, have the highest correlation with the actual quality of life index. We also learned a lot outside of the class about how to access like on-campus resources, especially through the College of Computing. Also more interesting ways to visualize data, which is really interesting because you always see data, but you don't really realize the kind of work that goes into it behind the scenes, which is also pretty cool, being an IE major. We also learned that the true data types were the friends that we made along the way. Our greatest challenge overall was visualizing what our final product was going to look like during the cleaning process, and then just coming up with useful visualizations to kind of show what our conclusions looked like once we finished. Thank you so much for listening, and that concludes our presentation.